Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World. I'm your host, Kane Sims, and got a lovely discussion lined up for you today. We'll be speaking to Alan Nichol, the CEO of Rasa, and we'll be climbing into all kinds of NLU-based details, which I'm supremely looking forward to. But before we do that, shout out to Deepgram and Symbl.ai, our presenting sponsors. If you did join us for the webinar this Tuesday with Deepgram, you will have learned a hell of a lot about the technology and about the way it works and about how you can use it effectively, essentially training speech recognition models for your specific industry, for your specific use case, is an absolute must to get proper high accuracy into your NLU. When we're going to talk about the impact potentially of feeding accurate information into an NLU system in just a moment. To learn more about Deepgram and the ASR capabilities, please do go to deepgram.com/VUX World. That is deepgram.com/VUX World. And Symbl.ai specializes in conversational intelligence. Their APIs allow you to build a whole manner of different capabilities for your audio and speech based use cases. There's data within conversations that you probably don't even know exists. And what Symbl.ai can do is help you access it. You can do things like speaker diarization, topic summarization. You can build your own agent assist capabilities with Symbl.ai. You can do outbound dialers, voicemail detection, a whole manner of interesting use cases. So do check out Symbl.ai if you're interested in exploring that. That's SYMBL.ai. Quick shout out to two events that we're doing. So the Deepgram event that we did was a roaring success. I'll be speaking at an audio codes webinar this Tuesday, and it's all about contact center automation. I'll put the link down there in the show notes, and it'll be on LinkedIn if you're over there, and YouTube if there as well. Essentially, one of the biggest problems of automating call center conversations is actually that last mile, getting those conversations live in a call center. Lots of organizations will kind of host a call on a number that they've procured from another service. And if you do that, you miss out on a whole bunch of metadata that is absolutely crucial to deliver a proper customer experience, feeding context into the bot and sending people back to the right place when you want to escalate them to an agent and things like that. And we're going to be covering some strategic tips and pointers for call center strategy, roadmap planning, technology identification, and all that kind of stuff, as well as showing you how to implement this stuff into your call center on your own without the need of any professional services from any company. So please do join us next Tuesday. I'll just put the link in the show notes there. And also another event that we're doing on April the 20th. This is with Core AI, and I'll put the link down here again so you can get to it quickly, which is all about is AI coming for your job? Essentially, the headlines would have you believe that AIs are taking over and a lot of people are going to be out of work because of it. But the reality is that most contact centers are not answering all the calls that they receive. The agents are overworked and there's a pretty poor customer experience. So we're going to be exploring how AI technologies can be used to help your call center agents deliver more effective, more streamlined, and a better quality customer experience through agent assist technologies. That's going to be on April the 20th with Raj Kaneru, the CEO of Core AI, and myself walking you through some of the key highlights and insights that you need that you can benefit from taking on board if you want to implement this stuff in your call center, what the value is, how you go about implementing it, what the technology is, and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully we'll see you there. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Alan Nichol of Rasa onto VUX World. Alan, welcome.
Hi, Kane. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. I've been a long-time fan. What is it they say? Long-time listener, first-time caller?
Right.
Been following Rasa for a long time. I've probably read almost every post that you've put out there. I've heard a lot of your interviews that you've done on other podcasts and various places and that. So I am a genuine fan of Rasa technology, your approach, the way you think about conversation-driven development, the way you approach educating the community, and the whole philosophy behind the product. So I really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great to hear, and thanks for the warm intro.
Yeah, nice one. I was at the European Chatbot conference not last week, but the week before, and I think out of let's say, I don't know how many talks there was, but let's say there was a number of talks that were about research. So universities presenting research into natural language processing technologies. There was a few examples of companies that had implemented either chatbots or voice bots or something similar. And I would say there was about 40% maybe. This is just an arbitrary number, but there was a good proportion of them that mentioned Rasa by name as their technology choice. So you must be doing something right.
That's fantastic to hear. And yeah, no, we're obviously very glad to be so widely adopted and so broadly adopted as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm interested in kind of like maybe for those that haven't come across Rasa. There's a lot of people who listen to the show who are well versed in this kind of technology space, but there's also people who are fairly new, just getting their head around it, or people who haven't implemented anything yet, maybe assessing technology, stuff like that. I'm wondering if you can just give us a bit of a kind of high level, what is Rasa and what makes it different.
Yeah, no, happily. I mean, you just asked a founder to tell you why their startup is different. That's you can give me like a few hours on that. Yeah, so what Rasa is well, the first thing is Rasa, the open source framework, right? Which is a framework for building conversational applications that could be text, that can be voice. And so it's analogous to in web development something like Django or Rails or something like that, right? It's the skeleton that you use to build an application. It just happens to be in the domain of building conversational apps. And then we have a platform on top of that which expands just that internal AI core with all the workflows and everything else that you need in a larger team, to practice or to just put conversational AI in production and operationalize it.
Nice. So you've got the open source, but you've also got an enterprise version as of fairly recently. What does the enterprise thing do that the open source stuff doesn't?
Yeah. So, I mean, a very simple way, and this may be already leading into conversations we're going to have later in the podcast, but they're kind of two sides of the coin, right? So, on the one hand, you've got this framework which creates your assistant based on some data, right? You got some training data that goes into it. But then the question is like, where does that come from? In the ideal case, that comes from real conversations. And so that's part of what the tooling helps you do is take the conversations that are happening and turn them back into data to feed back into your assistant, right? So it's kind of two halves of the same problem. But beyond that, of course, the open source framework is really only intended for developers to use, right? It's very code first, it's very code heavy. Whereas the tooling, the teams that we work with are very multidisciplinary, right? And as you know very, very well, this is a nascent field, and so these job titles are constantly evolving. But you always have folks who are subject matter experts. You have folks who are doing part of the conversation design, whether they have that as a formal title or not. You have like a product owner type of persona. You might have like legal and compliance who weigh in on various things. So, it takes a village, right? It takes a multidisciplinary team to ship production AI, and it's not purely an engineering problem. And so that's something we try and tackle with the tooling, with the full platform, is bringing all of those folks together and giving everybody the ability to collaborate.
Right, I'm with you. Interesting. So what would be kind of? I've never actually used the enterprise version. So what would be an example of how that would work in practice? Let's say you've got a team, you've got a couple of engineers, maybe someone who's responsible for design, maybe you've got some kind of like QA people who want to do some testing, you might have an analyst or something like that that is responsible for like ongoing assessment and maintenance, stuff like that. And a product owner that kind of wants to just have some visibility over what's going on. Maybe it's more, but like let's just take a small team like that. How would the tool be used by those on a daily basis? Like what features are for different groups and how does it manifest itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So on the on the UI side, on the tooling side, we've got a bunch of things for for example, like editing the responses that your assistant sends, right? You have like a rich editor where you can preview messages with buttons and images and that kind of thing. You can review the training data that you've got. We've run like a nightly analysis of your training data to see if there are intents that are commonly confused or entities that are performing poorly. You can go and review those things. And importantly, what you also have in the platform is a stream of all the conversations that are happening, right? And so you can see, okay, where are things going well, where are things not going well, right? You can set up all sorts of filters and automated tags to look out for certain things that are important to you, right? And then you can say, hey, look, this type of conversation is behaving poorly. Why is that, right? And it's like, oh, well, maybe this intent is poorly designed, or it's just not performing very well, or maybe the copy of the response is suboptimal. It's really unambiguous and it's causing people to ask questions, or whatever else it might be, or it just might be, hey, users are asking for something that we haven't supported yet, right? You're learning so much from giving users access to a text box where they can say anything they want, right? I mean, that's the opportunity and the challenge of conversational AI, right? The opportunity is that people are telling you literally exactly what they want all the time in their own words. And the challenge is dealing with all of that, of course, gracefully, right? And something that's quite unique about the way that Rasa works is that you can do all of this nice collaboration in the UI, but the platform ultimately still goes back and treats Git as the source of truth, right? And that obviously is a natural progression for us because we started off as a developer tool, but it's actually something very, very powerful, and it unlocks a lot of interesting things. Because what it means is that you get all the nice collaboration features and you get all the easy to edit UIs, but you retain all of the benefits of shipping software like a professional, right? I mean, if you think about the way that like Fortune 500 companies ship their mobile app and their website, right? They have CI/CD set up and they have automated tests and they do regressions, right? And it's not like they use a WYSIWYG web editor to publish their website, right? Like you've got to have some standards, you've got to have some good software engineering practices, right? And so it's a fairly unique thing about Rasa is that you get to retain all of that, right? While still getting the editing and authoring capabilities on top of it.
Right, I'm with you. So it would be that, correct me if I'm wrong, would it be so that you have, let's say, perhaps the less technical people working on the kind of like interface side of things with the dialogue management and the kind of like, the analysis and stuff, but you would also still require some technical engineers in order to manage that back end code base. Is that correct or
What
not?
it does is like anyone can come in and modify, if they've got the right permissions, can come and modify things through the UI, whether that's the flow, whether that's the data for an intent, whether that's the pipeline that's used to train the NLU model, whatever it might be. And you can save and edit and confirm those changes. But the important thing is that is fed back into and synced back into that Git-based workflow that developers use, which means that you can trigger your usual deploy pipeline with all your safety guards in place, with all your tests running, with all your automatic deployments. If something goes wrong, you can roll back. Like all of these things that are absolutely, I would say, it's table stakes for shipping software that touches a lot of your customers and is high stakes. You get to benefit from all of those things, right? You don't have to throw all of that away.
Interesting. That's very interesting. What are some of the kind of like use cases that I mean, I don't know how much, I don't know how at liberty you are to talk about specific examples of specific companies. I know you've got a couple of labels on your website around T-Mobile and stuff like that. Recently made the Gartner Magic Quadrant as well. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Which is usually a symbol, a sign that there's a good amount of clients and that the clients are not dropping by the wayside. They're utilizing the technology and it's being proved out. So what are some examples of some like really good use cases that you're kind of like, when you're in a meeting with a potential large client, what are the ones that you go to and say, look what such and such has done?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think maybe to give a sense of where Rasa shines, it's also helpful to give a bit of context of where we started out, right? So Alex, my co-founder, and I were developers building chatbots. That's what we were doing before, and we were using the APIs that were available at the time, and trying to build some more sophisticated AI assistants, right? And what we realized very, very quickly was that there were all these like NLU APIs. There was really nothing for building multi-turn conversations, right? There wasn't anything for going beyond the basics, right? And so we saw an opportunity. I mean, you talked about research, right? We kind of went and looked, and there's 3 decades of research on how to build dialogue systems that we found, right? And we were like, well, why aren't there any products that make use of this stuff, right? That seems mad. So wouldn't it be cool if we could, build a library that's intended not for researchers, but for people who are building products that makes use of some of this research, like some of the state-of-the-art stuff, right? And let's not worry about being, optimized for that very first, hey, I'm new to chatbots, right? But let's optimize for, hey, you've done that, you've hit the end of the road with the simple stuff, and now you're ready to do it properly. Now you're ready to do it for real, right? And so that's how the company started. We always say, like, what are the real problems? What are the big challenges when you're trying to do this? Not like, what is the fastest way to build a chatbot in 3 minutes, but when this is a big, sophisticated deployment, and there's real investment behind it. What are the tools you need? What's the infrastructure you need, right? And so that that came initially through our developer community, right? Building really for developers who had built their first chatbot and were ready to do something more sophisticated. But it's also now true that we're an enterprise company. Those are also the enterprises that we work with and the ones where Rasa really shines, right? So I kind of think of 3 stages that large companies go through when they think about conversational AI, right? One is exploration, right? And this, people get curious about chatbots at various points, right? 2016 was obviously the first real big wave, right, of the really early adopters. But, it's kind of, hey, what could this technology mean for us? What might a chatbot mean for our business, right? Let's build some POCs and see what it could mean. And then usually 1 or 2 of those projects will get some traction, right? And that brings you to step 2, where you've got, a tactical implementation for like 1 part of your business, 1 page on your site, or maybe you've got like 2 or 3, and they're all built with different vendors, and they're all doing their thing. But you also realize that none of these are the platform that's going to take you somewhere else, right? And then 3 is you kind of look at that and you say, look, actually, conversational AI is going to be a key way that our customers are going to interact with us in the future, right? And the way that we see them talking to us is not, hey, I'm talking to this specific line of the business. They're talking to the brand, right? Because as a customer, like, I don't care if I'm talking to whatever department, right? Or whatever like sub business or segment, right? To me, it's this brand, whatever it might be, that I'm interacting with, and I expect them to know everything about me that I have told them some part of this brand, and I want that holistic experience. And so when you say, actually, what we want to build is, a digital concierge or a fully encompassing assistant that spans the lines of business that we have, that is a primary way for our customers to interact with us, that's when you start to look at these platforms and you start to have very different criteria, right? You're looking for very different things from that first kind of initial deployment, prototyping phase. And so that's where Rasa really shines, because then you go, oh, actually, no, yeah, this is like, we want a piece of infrastructure, right? We don't want like a little box where we can tweak things. We want a piece of infrastructure we can deploy and integrate with other systems. We want to be able to ship this mission critical application the way we ship other mission critical software, right? And we're going to have a multidisciplinary team working on this together, not just like a few people, clicking together an experience, right? And so you've got all these different dimensions of complexity. You've got multiple different parts of the assistant. You've maybe got it in multiple languages. You've got it on multiple channels. And when you're ready for that level of strategic investment in conversational AI, then that's where Rasa really shines and stands out from the competition in a big way, because it enables you to do things that you simply cannot do with other platforms, which are more optimized for that initial ease of use and simplicity, right?
Interesting. So would your predominant clients be companies that have done some degree of experimentation and almost they're beginning to mature? They understand the technology, they understand the core kind of principles, they've got some experience and resources, and they want to get rid of the kind of like toys and start doing things properly. Is that?
Yeah, it's almost like a linear function. Like the more experience you have with conversational AI, the more you appreciate Rasa, I would say.
Interesting. Interesting. So you mentioned some of the things there that large enterprises value, things around being able to utilize this as a core piece of infrastructure, have something that they can fully control and manage, have something that is part of their kind of deployment pipeline that meets their security standards and QA standards that are already in place with other software. What are some of the other things perhaps that enterprises are using as their decision making criteria when they're kind of deciding whether to use Rasa or similar tools?
Yeah. So I think compared to other open source companies, right? If I think about the great open source success stories that I admire and look up to, right? You think about MongoDB and Elastic, right? And all these fantastic companies. I think there are two really key differences to Rasa and our market compared to other open source companies. The first is that it's really not an IT decision, right? Like, I don't think anyone outside of engineering is going to have an opinion on whether you use MongoDB or another NoSQL database, right? That would be madness. Of course, when you're choosing a conversational AI platform, there are lots of people with skin in the game. So it's a multi-stakeholder decision, right? And everybody has to have their needs met to some extent, and everybody has an important contribution to make, right? And so it's not a question of just convincing the engineering segment. The second piece I would say is that compared to other products, other open source products, like the open sourceness of Rasa is really important to the quality of the user experience, right? The fact that you can hack it, the fact that it's incredibly modular, the fact that you can, swap out any language model. You can say, I want to use BERT, I want to use GPT-2. Oh no, there's the next cool thing that's just been released. I'm going to use that instead. I'm going to use the French version. I'm going to use the distilled, lightweight, multilingual version, whatever it might be, right? You can, or you can build your own, right? You can plug and play your NLU pipeline and your NLU architecture. And you can build on top of, all the great developments that happen in open source. And also you can customize how the dialogue management works, how the NLG works, whatever else it might be, right? Because there are so many hard problems in conversational AI, and there's so many things where we haven't found a great general solution, right? Like, what's the best, most generic mechanism for doing intelligent fallback and like refining, taking your best guess of what the user says and refining that, right? There isn't yet a perfect solution, right? But if you have a solution that works really well for your domain or your use case, you just like hack it into Rasa in a couple lines of code, and now you have something that works great. You're not waiting for us, you're not filing a ticket waiting for us to implement this and us deciding that it's not general enough and then putting it in the pocket, right? You can just go and do it. And so, the majority of our customers have some kind of customization. They've either built a custom component or they somehow leverage that, right? And I think that's so deeply foundationally different to MongoDB, right? Like, if you have custom MongoDB code, something has gone very deeply wrong in the engineering organization, right? That is not something that you should be doing. Whereas with Rasa, it's perfectly natural to extend it, also because it is a framework and not just a data store or a simple API or something like that. It's a framework that you're using to build an app. So, it's also perfectly reasonable that you might wish to customize that. And then that level of control and transparency that it gives you over the AI components, over how the machine learning works, right? You can choose the different components. You can do like the most rigorous analysis you want in the world of how your model's performing, where it's performing well, where it's performing poorly, right? You have the full data science ecosystem at your disposal. You have the data, you have the open source code, you can write some scripts, you can build notebooks, all those kinds of things. So in terms of not having a black box NLU model that you hit a train button and goodness knows what happens and goodness knows if it's any good, you have something you can really pick apart, make your own, customize, deeply understand its performance. And same for the dialogue management components and NLG and everything else, right? And again, those things might seem like nice to haves if you're new to conversational AI, but once you're deep into it and you have some experience, you realize that actually you need those things to build the kinds of experiences that people are trying to achieve when they want to build a marquee flagship conversational assistant that gets the brand name attached to it, gets put front and center on the website or the mobile app or something like that. It's got to be a great experience. It can't be like an okay experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it wouldn't get used otherwise, would it? It's interesting hearing you speak there about the flexibility, the composability of the solution. I've been thinking a lot lately about um, the kind of resources and teams it needs to stand this stuff up, the kind of technology that's available out there in the market, and how different types of technology fit different types of companies. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with, if you're a relatively immature organization, and I don't mean necessarily childish, but a company who's never a company who's never really done it before, the typical kind of go-to solution is something like Dialogflow, or perhaps like a low-code drag and drop builder where you don't really actually need to know that much about what's happening technology wise. You don't really need to know about an NLU. It would be helpful if you knew about training data and all that kind of stuff, but you can still cobble something together. That's obviously miles different to deploying something, as you said, that flagship enterprise assistant that is multi-channel, covering a bunch of different use cases, totally different beast. And so I've been thinking a lot about like the team requirements to set something like this up, because I think that a lot of these low code drag and drop builders, and I think that they definitely do have a place, and they certainly democratize access to pretty powerful technology. But there may be a limit in the way that it's packaged in terms of your ability to be able to get a high degree of accuracy out of it. And so hearing you talk about Rasa, it sounds as though definitely if someone's going to use Rasa, they absolutely need some engineers and some technical skill sets within their team. People who understand conversational AI infrastructure and understand their way around an NLU model, understand their way around a dialogue manager, understand the real component parts in great detail. I'm wondering whether you could share your thoughts on, you know, what does the ideal team look like? Is it predominantly engineers and developers that use Rasa? Is that the current makeup of most teams? Is it design development working in tandem together? Like what sort of where are the data scientists and all of this? Like, what's your general observations on the type of teams that are using Rasa and the makeup of them?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, as you go through different stages, you have different sizes of teams, right? And a typical small team we see starting with Rasa will be like 3 or 4 people, right? And it'd be 1 or 2 engineers, one of whom has a little bit of data science chops, and then 1 or 2 folks who are there to care about the user experience, to design it, to think about it, right? And that is 2 very broad personas, and as this field is quite nascent, people might come from different backgrounds and have different types of experience and all sorts of things. That's a kind of small team. A typical team, would be like on the order of 8 folks or so, right? And then you start to see that you have a significant number of folks who aren't engineers, thinking about these things. And then we see really large teams, right? Where we have some of our large enterprises that we work with, where there's really a hub and spoke model, right? And so there's a central team who are like the deep experts in Rasa, the deep experts in NLP, and then there are sort of feature teams that are supported by them that build some pieces of the functionality, right? And then you have to think about this whole workflow of like, how do we work on one large assistant as a set of sub teams without stepping on each other's toes, right? And like once again, there are lots of good ideas from other kinds of software that you can borrow there, right? Not everything applies, but some you can perfectly well transplant. And so I think if you talk to 10 large enterprises and their teams and how they describe the personas on their team, you will get common patterns of the types of folks who are involved and the types of skill sets that are needed, but a very heterogeneous mix of like job titles and organizations, right? Like we're not at a stage where this has been standardized and everybody calls things by the same. Of course, you've got like content owners and content managers. You've got designers, conversation designers. You've got product owners. You've got data scientists, NLU tuners. Sometimes, the question is like who's ultimately responsible for the quality of your NLU data and your NLU model. Those things, they just vary, right? I ran a poll like not too long ago where I said like, who in your team is ultimately responsible for the quality of the data, and it was pretty evenly split across like 3 or 4 different personas. So
Wow, interesting. It's nice to have so much awareness recently. I don't know if it's just salient for me because I've been having a lot of conversations like this recently, but it's nice to see the importance of NLU quality of training data, monitoring, how the performance of different intents become part of the conversation. I think it shows a maturity of the industry in general and the practitioners within it, because 3 years ago I wasn't having anywhere near as many conversations about NLU accuracy, confidence scores, training data, quality management, and that kind of stuff. I don't know if your thoughts are the same in terms of the maturity of the industry.
For sure, right? And if I think about machine learning, and in this case specifically supervised learning, moving from something that people do primarily in the research world to now being vastly adopted across different industries and different applications and things, right? I think one of the things that took probably longer to translate than it should have is this idea that, like, when you're publishing a paper, typically there's a static benchmark and you tweak the model on a static set of data until you get the best performance, right? And so you get a lot of those ideas being transplanted, but like you don't have to accept a static data set, right? And so there's this whole movement around like data-centric AI, which is I think what Andrew Ng calls it, and what we talk about at Rasa, which is conversation-driven development, is really just the application of data-centric AI and what it means in in the conversational world. And if you grab a data scientist and you say, would you like to have a fancier neural network or better data? Every single one of them is going to say better data, because that's just what drives performance, right? And not to get too deep into it, but I think if you're thinking about a supervised learning problem today, right, the question, can I find a neural network that will fit this data that I've got? It's just not a concern in this day and age, right? Like with all the tooling, all the hardware and everything we've got, like the architectures that are well understood, like you will fit your data. The only question really is, if I fit this data, will that somehow solve my business problem, right? Does this data accurately represent the problem that I want it to solve? That's the real challenge, right? And so when you think about applying AI and specifically applying supervised learning, the main task is not tweaking hyperparameters and picking the next best BERT version. The main task is saying, does the data set that I'm training on represent the problem that I actually want to solve, right? And that's something that that we think a lot about and build a lot of product for at Rasa, which is this process of conversation-driven development, right? Which is really sort of two key ideas in CDD. One is bringing software development best practices into the world of conversational AI, right? And just saying, hey, look, maybe you should still write tests. Maybe you should still have a PI server. Maybe you should still do, continuous deployment, because this is a mission critical application, and so you need to treat it as such, right? And the other half of it is to say, hey, look, the problem you need to solve is, how can you create a data set that best represents how your users are actually talking, right? And so many engineers start off with this problem, and because you always have a cold start problem, very, very rarely does anybody have data to start with. Everybody starts by just like writing 5 or 10 examples per intent by hand, off the top of their head. But I mean, how would you feel, Kane, about getting in a self-driving car that had only been on a test track?
Yeah, or only done 10 laps.
Right, but specifically, right? And I think the first thing that you have to make as a mental shift is to at least evaluate your model on real data, right? Because that's the objective truth, right? Like, this is what users are saying, and how are you performing on that? And then, okay, maybe some synthetic data helps you or whatever else, but like primarily it's going to be a case of gathering real data and annotating it, right? And so sometimes you come across things where people say some really bizarre things that really confuse a lot of ideas, where people try and edit the training data before they show it to the model, because it's like, oh, this is complicated, right? It's as if you're like using real driving miles to drive a self-driving car, and you're removing all the miles where there's pedestrians, because pedestrians are difficult and we don't want to have to move them. And I don't want the model to learn about pedestrians because they just confuse it, right? Like, this is the data you're asking your model in production to make predictions about. So it better have seen some data, right? Like it can't possibly be too hard to see during training, but easy enough to handle at prediction time, right? That makes zero sense. I saw a really relevant question come up
Yeah.
in the chat, which I might jump in on.
Yeah, go
Which
on. Angel, shout out to Angel, who's on the podcast last week from Deutsche Telekom.
Yeah, Angel. I know him very well. Thanks for asking a question, Angel. Yeah, what role does tooling play? It is so crucially important. And I, like, over the last few years, have continuously underestimated how sophisticated of tooling you need to do CDD effectively at scale with multiple personas, with a large amount of data, right? It's a really gnarly and interesting problem, which is you have this stream of data, which is much more than you could ever possibly look at, right? And if I'm going to invest a human hour in improving my assistant based on this data, how am I going to know where to spend it? How am I going to spend it wisely? And how am I going to get feedback that the hour I just spent was well spent, right? And there are so many interesting sub problems in there, right? And this is what keeps us up at night and keeps us busy over at Rasa, is building that tooling that enables these large teams to do this kind of thing, because it's easy to explain conceptually, but to make it really efficient and work nicely in like an enterprise setting, this is a journey we're on, and interesting things coming out of it. So
It's a real challenge, isn't it? I mean, I've worked in the past before these tools like the AWS Intent Miner, and Genesis have got one. I'm sure Rasa's probably got something similar, and Human First, and others that have kind of like, you can just pipe a bunch of conversations in, and they'll take that real data, roll it up into a bunch of kind of like high level intents, and you've almost got a place to start. But even just going through live chat transcripts before that kind of tooling existed, and going through it and trying to familiarize yourself with what people are trying to get done, the kind of language that they use, and trying to pick apart not just training data but structures of conversations and stuff like that, which I actually recommend people do still, because it gets you understanding the actual complexities of a conversation. But you can't necessarily go ahead and build a production system off the back of an individual person reading thousands of transcripts, because it would just take you forever. And so there is a definite real challenge there, especially when you've got something live and it's out there in the wild, and you've got a website that's got 100,000 visitors a day, or you've got a call center that gets 40,000 calls a day, something like that, and it's like the data is just absolutely abundant, and it is a nightmare to keep on top of without the accurate tooling. So how does Rasa deal with that problem? You've kind of alluded to it keeping you up at night. Is there something that you have that makes this easier now, or is it something that you're kind of working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe quickly, just to sort of agree with what you said a second ago, right? I think it's so important, of course, to do things at scale and to analyze and look at the numbers and everything else, but there's no better pattern matcher than the human brain, right? And a really unique thing about conversational AI, unlike other kinds of software, is that we're constantly have the opportunity to look at a transcript, and we can exactly understand the whole experience that somebody had, right? Which is so different from other kinds of software that we build. You can look at it and you can empathize and understand exactly what the person wanted and what happened and what didn't happen, right? But yeah, in terms of how to solve these problems, right? So just had a really interesting conversation with the team today about this. It's an intersection of machine learning problems and like UX and human computer interaction problems, right? And it's the overlap of the two, right? Which is why it takes so much brain power to solve these efficiently and solve these well. And yeah, so we have a bunch of things already in the product for doing all these kinds of things, right? So as I alluded to, we have an insights feature. It analyzes your data overnight, both like the predictions that have been made and like the training data that you have. It looks at like intents that are commonly confused, looks at things that are frequently predicted with low confidence, all that kind of stuff. And then gives you kind of, actionable things to click on to say, hey, go edit this, go annotate some data for this, right? So that's one tiny slice of the whole puzzle of saying, where should I spend my time? What should I do? And then what feedback can I get that the changes that I've made are actually impactful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to own that whole journey to be able to answer those questions, right? And ultimately tie it to some kind of success rate or ROI or something that you're trying to generate, right? Because well, you want to know what number you're moving up at the end of the day. So this is a super active area of development. At Rasa, we have a whole bunch of a significant fraction of our resources, of our teams, like and brains working on this kind of stuff of like how do you do this efficiently in a large heterogeneous team with different skill sets, and how do you understand the impact of all of that work?
Yeah, how do you avoid messing it up, basically? Because
Yeah.
you could feed rubbish, into the model and have things go downhill. It was interesting. We spoke to Benoit Alvarez from Qbox recently, and he was talking about the idea of getting live transcripts as a basis for your training data being good practice in part. But he made a really interesting observation, which was that if somebody says something like, I was on holiday last week and I've lost my credit card,
Mhm.
then his observation was that the first part of that utterance is kind of pointless. I was on holiday last week. It's a in his words, not to paraphrase, but the gist of the conversation was that the first part of that utterance is kind of rubbish and stands a good chance of confusing other parts of the model potentially. And so the live transcript might have been, I was on holiday last week and lost my credit card. The piece that's important is the bit that says I've lost my credit card. So you might discard the first part of the utterance and keep the second part to put into the training data. I'm interested in getting your thoughts because you've had a bunch of experience on taking real data, real customer data, building models off the back of it. What's your thoughts on taking verbatim utterances, using that as training data and rolling with it versus doing some kind of human cleansing of it first?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would say is that you don't get to edit it when the user sends it. You don't get you don't get to uh, edit it in real time, right? So you're still asking if you're worried about it confusing your model, teach your model not to be confused, right? So this is the metaphor I would say is like this is as if you're going and creating a data set for your self-driving car and you're deleting all the confusing
Right,
situations from it, all the
right.
difficult parts, all the bits with pedestrians, all the bits with bad weather, like happens. And so, I mean, I think that there's a real amount of truth to that. There's a kernel of truth to that, right? Which is not to be dismissed. Which is that, as you say, the first part of the sentence is meaningless in that case, right? And the person could provide any kind of context, right? And really, what you want to do is the model should have some kind of invariance to that and should only pay attention to that, right? And I mean, that's also a very active area of machine learning research is, can you encode that kind of domain knowledge, right? To say, hey, look, actually, only this part is really salient. And I'm sure we can build better models to learn to ignore those things. But I think pretending that they don't happen isn't setting your model up for success, right? And if you're evaluating on that cleaned up data as well, you're probably going to trick yourself into thinking your model's performing really well because you're only evaluating on the easy cases that you cleaned up to help the model out.
Interesting.
First things first, please evaluate on real data.
That's really interesting. And this would require, I think, some pretty sophisticated NLU capabilities, but you miss out on the opportunity to provide a really personalized experience, which is that in an ideal world, what a human would do in that case would be if someone says I was on holiday and I lost my credit card, that's different to somebody saying, "Can you freeze my credit card?" Probably the same intent, but completely different kind of context. And so a human would say, "Oh, I'm sorry about that. Hope you had a nice holiday otherwise," or build rapport like that, referring to what was just said. And I suppose, you know, whether that sounds like a bit of a sophisticated thing for a bot to be able to do is recognize the first part and reference it next to say that I understand you're on holiday and I hope you had a nice time otherwise, but let me get your card frozen. But that's the kind of really personalized use cases and interactions that I think we'll be heading towards in future. And you probably sacrifice the ability to create those if you do tamper with the data.
Yeah, well, and you know how I feel about intents, Kane.
I do. I'm interested. I'm interested in getting this on record because I've read a lot and heard a lot about your thoughts on intents, and I've actually been doing quite a bit of research myself around the whole transformer model, and we had Jason Mars from Zero Shot Bot, and we had Chandra Khatri from Got It AI and stuff. Been looking at interested in exploring those kind of like transformer based models and stuff, and they're all kind of very much about uh, intentless NLUs. So I'm really
Cool.
curious to kind of get your thoughts on that. Like, what is, in your view, what's the fundamental problem with intents? Maybe to start.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I love intents, and I think they're fantastic. Okay, so what do we mean when we say intents, right? We have the list of all possible things that humans might say in a conversation, which is infinite. And we are collapsing that down into a problem where we're saying a user is going to say one of these 20, 30, 40 things. They're going to say hello, they're going to say yes, no, thank you, I need a credit card, whatever it might be, right? And that is a phenomenal simplification of the task of understanding any possible structure, right? I gave a talk about this recently, and a sentence I pulled up was like Iceland's president admits he went too far with threat to ban pineapple pizza or something along those lines, right? And like you can understand that sentence. It has all sorts of interesting compositional structure. A lot of it actually isn't really language understanding. It's like common sense. It's you understanding the world that you and I inhabit, right? There might be other humans on this planet who would have no relevant context or know why pineapple pizza is controversial or whatever else. So there's so much going on there, right? And that's an almost impossible problem. And we're not asking to solve that problem. We're just saying, hey, look, pick which of these 20 things the person is saying, right? But of course, like that's not how humans talk. Humans don't dream up the intent they would like to express and then think of a way to usher that, right? And so the example that you gave, right? I've been on holiday, what the person is saying is perfectly clear. They're telling you a very clear story, right? And we as developers, we tend to think of this as like ambiguity, but it's not ambiguity, right? Like the person is telling you something about their life, about their experience. It's very direct, it's factual, right? And it's only ambiguous to us because we're not sure how to help them, or we've got to figure out what the right thing is to do, right? And so it's on us as developers, and I mean that in the broader sense of people who are building assistants. It's on us to understand that and cater to that. And I don't think it's impossible by any means to answer both those things effectively, right? And utter a nice message about the holiday, hope you had a nice relaxing time, and then get to the task at hand. That doesn't, of all the hard problems in ML, that seems like a doable one. What it does point to in this particular case is that this message isn't mapped to a single intent, right? In any case, it's not a single intent, right? And so you have this fantastic simplification of the problem, which is all I have to do is pick one of these 20 labels, and that's my understanding of what the user says. But that's, of course, like a very impoverished model of understanding, right? Like you haven't understood it by bucketing it correctly. And there's so much nuance and there's so much more to language, right? And so not every message fits into one intent neatly, right? And sometimes the intent is purely contextual, right? And so the example I gave in the blog post that you mentioned is, if you recommend to the user to have the user's talking about restaurants and you say, how about Chinese food? And the user says, I had that yesterday, right? That's a very sort of pragmatic implication. And you and I might say, well, probably they want something else. A computer might say, hey, well, they had it. Maybe they have it every night. Maybe I should recommend it.
Yeah. There's another good one which you referenced, which was that it was something to do with an airline booking, and it's the bot said something like, I can't remember what it said specifically, but it said something like, are you delayed or something like that? And the user replied, unfortunately, which was actually a yes.
Yeah. And so unfortunately, as an intent example for the intent, yes, or I had that yesterday as an example for the intent, no, it doesn't make any sense, right? It's only in that particular context. And so, so what we talk about in that blog post is, some experimental work that we did on saying, hey, look, it doesn't actually matter what the intent is. What matters is, do you know how to respond to the user? So, this middle intermediate step of picking the right intent, let's just skip it and go straight from the message to predicting the correct next action, right? And we can
Mm.
contextually interpret it in this particular case. Now that has a whole other set of like data management problems and how do you build these kind of end-to-end stories and everything else. So that's also non-trivial, but I think it, I don't think we're ever going to build, truly sophisticated conversational AI by cramming every message into one intent, right? That
Yeah.
just fundamentally
Yeah.
won't work.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Are you familiar with a company called Action AI?
I am
Based
not,
in the
no.
UK. So they've got a very interesting approach to this, which is that I think they technically use intents, kind of, but they're more concerned with the semantic understanding of the words that were said. So they're not interested necessarily in saying that means this intent, let's go and do this. They're more interested in working out the semantics and the composition and the ontology behind the words that are said, and then determining they've got pretty sophisticated like entity recognition, so that helps figure out
Yeah.
what's what. But they can do things like I'm assuming that you could build this with Rasa potentially, but things like if someone says that example there, I went on holiday and I lost my credit card. They might have like typically that might be two intents. I went on holiday. It might not be an intent as in I want to do something, but it's valuable information that can be used in a response. And then I lost my credit card is something that has subtext to it, which is I want to report my credit card as stolen or lost or whatever. And so because they don't necessarily strictly use intents as we would know them, and they use this kind of like granular semantic understanding, which when combined with the speech recognition actually begins to predict what's going on in the sentence as it's said, rather than feeding text to an NLU and then figuring it out. So it's all pretty sophisticated stuff, but a long-winded way of saying I totally concur with what you're saying around, the
That sounds
skipping
really
of the intent part, provided you can get the semantic understanding right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, for that particular case, you can have multi-intents in browser, so you can predict two intents for one message. So
Yeah, I thought
in most cases, there's at least something. But then there's still the you still have to take care of the other half, right?
yeah.
Because it's nice to say that you've detected two intents, but how do those meanings compose together? If it's you've detected if somebody says yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's a different composition from a neutral statement about going on a holiday and then a direct request. So you can't just like arbitrarily compose intent labels together either. So you still need to
Yeah.
use some human brain power to figure out what to do with it on the other side.
Interesting. We're almost on time. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, let's say that we were to draw a kind of a continuum, a line from kind of like the beginnings of natural language processing. You can go back if you want as far as Audrey and Shoebox and stuff like that. But let's say the beginning of production value, natural human-like conversational assistants. I think you mentioned 2016 with like Facebook Messenger and when Dialogue acquired API.ai and all that kind of stuff. Let's maybe use that. If you were to draw a line and say there'll be a point in time where the tooling has everything that's needed, the problem of language understanding is pretty much solved, and we have everything we need to be able to create those, absolutely faultless AI experiences. Where do you think we are on that continuum
Oh,
at
goodness
this
me.
moment in time?
I think we've got a long ways to go. I mean, we have a maturity model we talk about at Rasa
Yeah,
of the 5 levels of conversational AI, right? I think we are, still trying to make true level 3 become a reality, right? And so, never make predictions, especially about the future. I wouldn't say how much longer it's going to take.
it doesn't need to have a timeline on it. It just like where do you think we are? As let's say like 100% is we're finished. We've got everything we need. We can kind of just build some good stuff versus 0 being we can't understand a word that anyone's saying.
20%. If you're going to put me on the spot, that's where we are.
Wow, interesting. But isn't that interesting though that there is actually there's some bad stuff being built, and everyone's had a really bad experience with a chatbot and a voice bot. But actually, there's some pretty decent stuff being built. There's some, the businesses are using it, they're getting value from it. consumers and users are kind of understanding where the limitations are at the moment they're using them. There's actually surveys out there with people desiring more interactions with AI assistants and stuff like that. So from where we are, if we are 20% towards solving the full kind of language understanding problem, then I think that's actually pretty good progress.
I agree. I mean, I'm obviously very bearish on the technology. Wouldn't be doing this, right? And we see the fantastic success that our customers achieve with deploying conversational AI, and it has a huge impact on businesses, right? And so I guess I would decouple the things, right? If you were to ask me the question of like, how far in the realm of like having a meaningful impact on business today are we're very much further along, right? We do that fantastically well. If we if we think about the perfect assistant, it's a longer way away.
Nice. Wicked. That's interesting. Well, Alan, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said, genuine. No, you're welcome. More than welcome. And I'm happy to do this as and when you would like to. I'm a big fan of Rasa. Love the conversation. For those tuning in on the podcast or on LinkedIn or YouTube, rasa.com, rasa.com. There's, as Alan was saying, there's an open source capability there, which you can have a look at. If you're getting more sophisticated, you can obviously have a look at the enterprise edition. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, lots of companies that I wouldn't have known. Basically, I went to that conference the other week, and I would say about 30 to 40% of the companies that were talking about what they've deployed were using Rasa. So placed in a Gartner Magic Quadrant, well adopted by large enterprises, really good understanding of the technology and what needs to happen to make these things work really well. So yeah, hats off to you, and good luck, and thanks very much. So do join me next week when next week what will be happening. I'll just quickly pull it up while you're here. Audio Codes webinar on Tuesday. We've got Matt Smallman on the podcast on Wednesday talking about voice biometrics. That's going to be an absolutely epic one. And we have OpenStream on the podcast on Thursday discussing the OpenStream approach. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Alan. It's been absolutely immense. And
thanks everyone for listening.